I'm going to start with a little bit of historical background on the FBI in particular, just before I get there, since we're talking about profiling generally. A few things to note. First, profiling is more than just racial, right? You can have lots of different kinds of profiling. You can have profiling according to national origin, you can have profiling according to religion, and it can be different agencies doing it. It can be Customs and Border Protection, interrogating you about your religious practices at the border or at an airport when you're flying home from a visit abroad. It can be the insert here police department, DC Metro, stopping someone illegitimately while they're driving. It can be ICE, Immigration's Customs Enforcement, stopping people while crossing the street or raiding a workplace. All of those practices are illegitimate. What they share is a disregard for constitutional rights, and in particular the Fourth Amendment right to require authorities to have individualized suspicion before stopping someone, searching them, seizing them. There's a whole new migration of police tactics and an evolution among them. What the framers of our Constitution knew as searches and seizures, police and intelligence agencies and federal law enforcement agencies today know as a whole range of tools, not just searches and seizures, but also infiltrations, monitoring, electronic sort of signal monitoring. All of these sorts of practices are at least as offensive to the underlying privacy interests that the framers aim to protect with the Fourth Amendment. They wrote searches and seizures because it's all they had then. As our society has progressed, the Fourth Amendment has lost its meaning in a technologically advanced age where our law enforcement agencies have new tools at their disposal that they disclaim any applicability of these requirements. So the point of all that is, whether it's driving while black, crossing the street while Muslim, whether it's breathing while Latino, all of those kinds of practices are illegitimate. And whatever the shade of brown of one's skin, or the shade of unpopular one's ideology, or the shade of marginalization of one's faith, we all, as Americans, share interest in these core constitutional rights. And so just to frame that very briefly. The FBI in particular has a sordid history. It is a recidivist agency which over the course of its history has been a law violation agency as often as it has been a law enforcement agency. And you can go back to its origins around the time of the Palmer raids, when ideology was explicitly, much like my colleague Steve was talking about before, ideology being used as a basis for suspicion or even presumptive guilt. Fast forward after that to the McCarthy era in the 1950s, when through the Red Scare, the FBI became a tool for essentially a political witch hunt that went on across the country for decades. Its most prolific target during that time, it's ironic that we're meeting in a library named after Dr. Martin Luther King, who of course was not only harassed by the FBI, but the target of a quite vicious character assassination campaign. There are documented plots by the FBI to attempt to drive civil rights leaders to suicide. And that was successful, not in his case, but at least others. There's an actress, Jean Seberg, who was essentially driven to suicide by an FBI campaign to slander her because she was a civil rights activist. The particular nature of the slander took the form of a fake letter to her husband alleging that a baby she was carrying was fathered by a Black Panther. So tell me if that sounds like law enforcement to you. In the 1980s, even after the Senate acted in the Church Committee hearings in the 70s to put an end to this practice, and after the Attorney General in 1976, Edward Levy, implemented a set of guidelines to stop political profiling, infiltration, these sorts of abuses by the FBI. Still, notwithstanding those limits, in the 1980s, the FBI investigated people involved with the coalition in solidarity with the people of El Salvador. And so still, political ideology with respect to foreign policy in particular, being used as a basis for presumptive suspicion, if not outright guilt. Fast forward further into the 90s, it was radical environmentalists. The Earth Liberation Front and the Animal Liberation Front are the two organizations, to call them organizations would be inflating the networks, let's say, from which the FBI has internalized this notion, and the intelligence community generally, that environmentalists are security threats. If you go to, later in the afternoon, I imagine you'll be hearing about the conditions of confinement of many people who have been accused and convicted of terrorism-related offenses, however unrelated to actual terrorism those offenses are. But if you go to those facilities, the two groups you will find are Muslims and white environmentalists, because environmentalists have been facing a witch hunt by the FBI that goes on over a decade. The Animal Enterprise Terrorism Act, I think it was 1996 or 98, late 90s, before 9/11. So free speech was rendered criminal long before the lens got turned onto us, and Muslim Americans, right? We are just the latest in a series of canaries singing in a coal mine as it collapses. And this is a civilizational crisis that affects not just us, and not just environmentalists, not just leftists, not just people who care about Latin America, or the anti-war activists and peace activists who have increasingly become targets of the FBI's political marginalization. But this is something that we all share as Americans. This is a crisis that I think we are called on to confront.